Next, I want to talk about some aspects of Europe's physical geography. So let's talk about a little bit of the physical environment of Europe. And this is a figure showing Europe's physical landscapes. Let's kind of go through them one by one. So here we have very mountainous environments. We call that the alpine system of mountains. And one thing unique about the mountain systems in Europe, we have, they're not insignificant. The Alps are a big mountain range. We also have the Carpathian Mountains and the Pyrenees here in Spain. But one thing about them is they run east and west. And one thing notable about them running east and west is that reduces the amount of rain shadow effect, because winds blow from west to east. They blow in a certain direction. And in North America, the winds blow against the mountain ranges. In Europe, they tend to blow over the mountain ranges. This is what's called the alpine system, the more mountainous parts of Europe. And just beyond that, this area that's kind of here in this yellow, you have uplands, or areas with low hills. This area here, as well as the western uplands, these are kind of like old mountain ranges, kind of like the mountains in the east coast of the United States, the Appalachian Mountains. These are things that maybe were big mountain ranges at one time, but have been really worn down over time. But you do have these kind of low hills, like the Scottish Highlands, some in places like Norway and central part of Spain and so on. And then lastly, you have this part in green called the North European lowland. And also it's called the European plain at times. We'll kind of talk about that when we get to the Russia chapter. But our book calls it the North European lowland. Other books call it the European plain. And it extends from Britain all the way into Russia. It's not shown in this figure here, but when we get to the Russia chapter, we're going to see how this kind of keeps on going right up to the Ural Mountains through Russia. Now, it might seem odd that this plain would kind of start here in Britain, even though that's an island, but the reality is that Britain is physically connected to the rest of Europe. It's that since the Pleistocene, since the Ice Ages, as sea levels have risen, this channel has kind of filled up with water, but underneath, it's part of the same physical continent. Now, one thing about the Northern European lowland in particular is the presence of large navigable rivers. So major rivers crisscross Europe through the zone. And this is also where you have the highest concentration of population in Europe, is this North European lowland. So here, this is a boat towing a bunch of cargo containers. These can be transported very easily throughout Europe and then make their way to ocean ports. Now, this is showing the physical landscapes and the population distribution. And you can see there's some, particularly in the North European lowland, and then also in some of the central uplands, you see some of the denser populations in Europe. This is some of the smaller countries called Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, very densely populated, same with United Kingdom, into Germany, and so on. Then this is kind of up in the Alps for more mountainous, less dense population. I wanted to include this figure because what it does is it's an overlay of North America with Europe, and it's also correct by latitude. So in the kind of the dark color back here, the Spain and Italy, the southern part of Europe, what I want to highlight is that Fresno would be about here in California. So where we are in Fresno, that would be about the latitude of the southern edge of the European realm. Italy, Spain, Greece are about the same latitude of California. However, if you get up to the Scandinavian countries, their latitude would be comparable to very far up into Canada. In fact, if you look at the United Kingdom, England, Ireland, so on, they're farther north than anywhere in the United States. So Same goes with much of Germany, of the Scandinavian countries, is that they are at very high latitudes, many of these places. However, their climate is quite mild, and a lot of that has to do with some particulars of ocean, the way that oceans circulate and move water around. We'll talk about that more specifically. And so if you look at this figure that shows the types of climates, we introduced them briefly in the beginning of the semester, that most of Europe, at least Western Europe, has what's called sea climates. Sea climates are moderate climates that don't get too cold in the wintertime, even really far at really high latitudes, including parts of Iceland and parts of Norway. As you get into the interior, you get into more what we call continental climates. We'll come back and talk about those later, but much of Europe has what's called a sea climate. These are moderate and wet climates. Climates that get a decent amount of rainfall, but they don't get too cold. And one thing I will highlight really quickly, we have these types of climates in the United States as well on our west coast, but they don't extend as far into the United States as these climates do in Europe. And one reason for that is the way that our mountains are configured are different than Europe, that our mountains run north and south. And so that creates a rain shadow effect that we've discussed for North America. But you don't have as much of a rain shadow effect for Europe because its mountain ranges aren't perpendicular to the wind. They run parallel to the winds. The winds move in this general direction, and they tend to run along the mountain ranges rather than against the mountain ranges. So much of Europe has sea climates. Just to review, these are moderate and wet climates. They range from places that are very wet to those that are wet part of the year. The ones that are the wet part of the year are Mediterranean climates. And we have Mediterranean climates in California. One thing we've discussed is that the country of Chile in South America also has Mediterranean climates. And the name comes from the Mediterranean Sea. So these are an important climate, particularly in Southern Europe, and with a lot of similarities to California or Chile. In fact, these photos are from California, but this is to demonstrate these are dry summer climates like we would experience in California. And so going back a little bit, so just like California is on the west coast at this latitude, the Mediterranean Sea is about the same latitude, also on the west coast, and so it has a lot of similarities to California in terms of climate and environment. Now, even though, one thing that we highlighted that, Iceland and some of these Scandinavian countries have moderate climates. They're not super cold, even though they're at very high latitudes. And a lot of that has to do with something called the North Atlantic Drift. And let me kind of zoom in on that. So the North Atlantic Drift here, it brings warm water. So water kind of moves in a circular pattern. And so water from the warm water from the Caribbean Ocean circulates back up and far into the northern hemisphere along this it drifts very far north along this North Atlantic Drift. And the North Atlantic Drift helps to keep Europe's climate relatively warm, particularly for its latitude. So here we have, Canada and Greenland here, which are frozen. And then we have, other countries in Europe which are not frozen because this warm water helps to moderate their climate. And then the other thing we talked about is we have Mediterranean climates in Southern Europe, or what we call Mediterranean Europe, along the sea here, which are dry in the summer and wet in the winter, like California.